Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is April of 2019. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the McMartin Preschool case. The McMartin Preschool case is the critical linchpin to the so-called Satanic Panic of the 1980s. However, before I jump into that, there are a few things that need to be said about sources that I have used in being able to put all of this together. The research for this has taken much longer than I had originally anticipated. However, I was helped out greatly by a number of sources. So before I ever even started this project, I had started to hear a number of online commentators start giving their opinions about the Satanic Panic. And I noted that a lot of what they had to say was absolutely preposterous. Now, the thing that really jumped out to me is a number of these commentators were too young to have actually lived through the time period, which means, of course, they had to learn it from some other place. And since I am old enough and I actually did live through it, I remember the conversations that my parents had, that my aunts and uncles had. I remember what my grandparents had to say during this time. And so I knew that there were a number of huge flaws, a number of huge problems with what they were calling the Satanic Panic. So I wanted to dig back into the sources and sort of determine, how did they come to this idea? Where did they get this notion? Basically they boil it down to where they say, a whole lot of Christians got totally crazy in the 1980s, and they started to say that Dungeons and Dragons was going to get everybody's kids possessed, and they were going to go crazy and commit suicide or kill other people and be involved in Satanism. And if they listened to AC/DC, it was Antichrist Devil's Child, and they were going to do backmasking and hear all these secret messages and lose their minds and start killing people and all this kind of stuff. And I knew there were a lot of problems with it, so they continually made all these references to the daycare or preschool cases that had come up throughout the 1980s, and I knew that a lot of what they were saying about those were quite simply false. These were false claims being made, and I wanted to know how they came up with so many false claims about this time period. So what I did in terms of sources is I went to a lot of the local newspapers around the Manhattan Beach area in California. I went to the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and Washington Post, of all places, which actually did some pretty decent reporting on all of these cases very early on. That stuff seemed to start changing somewhere in the mid-1980s towards the later 1980s, and especially in the early 1990s, the entire thing flipped over from basically should you believe the children, to absolutely do not trust the children at all. Children are going to make up all kinds of wild accusations and ruin the lives of adults and all this sort of stuff. So you saw this changeover from maybe we should listen to the children to the adult world should always come first. The world of children should always come last. And during this process, I ended up finding a very interesting fellow, a leftist professor of all things from Brown University, Professor Ross Cheit, who wrote a book that was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. It's over 500 pages long with some 70 or so pages of footnotes, called The Witch Hunt Narrative: Politics, Psychology, and the Sexual Abuse of Children. And this was a real eye-opener because it started to confirm many of the suspicions that I already had, except he did this in spades. It's an absolutely incredible book, an incredible resource. I may end up doing an entirely separate episode just reviewing the book cover to cover because it's fantastic. Professor Cheit himself points out in the book that he was a victim of child sexual abuse, that it happened in an institutional instance, and that the people involved in the institution worked to cover up that these kinds of things had happened to him and to other child victims. So he already knew before he got into this that these kinds of things actually take place and they get covered up. So he goes into detail where he talks about the Penn State case with Jerry Sandusky, which I mentioned in the first component of this. And he also talks about the Catholic Church cover-up and about the Boy Scouts. Professor Cheit worked on the book for some 15 years or so. He is still working on aspects related to this for other publications that he's going to have that come out down the road. but he had the help from some 80 or so graduate students who helped him to gather up the original source documentation, the investigation notes from police officers, the trial transcripts, all these kinds of things. He had lots of the information that was typed up and documented. So this is an absolutely fantastic resource for anyone who wants to look into this deeper, and I will link all of the relevant material below. Another important thing that you need to know when it comes to the concept of SRA, or satanic ritual abuse, is that the people who have manufactured this satanic panic mythos, as it were, as I would prefer to call it, which Professor Cheit calls the witch hunt narrative, they're very tricky, they're very deceptive people in general. A lot of times they'll conflate things that should not be conflated, like many of the cases that they talk about in this. They just lump them all together and act like they're all the same, and that if a person was innocent in this case, that means all of the other people are innocent in these separate cases as well. And they often try to act like there was never any evidence that ever supported any of this stuff, that none of it should have ever been investigated to begin with. It certainly never should have went to trial. There never should have been any arrests. And they also try to say that there false convictions that never should have taken place and all of that. And some of these have actually been turned over on appeal, but usually for technicalities. They don't like to mention that part. They just act like, oh, well, it was overturned because this person never actually did anything at all. They were completely and totally innocent. And this is simply not the case. Once you read this book, you'll find out so much more. But it's important to note that that a guilty verdict does not always mean that the person actually did it. We've seen that over and over again. We've seen the Innocence Project and so on. We've seen people have false confessions and all this kind of thing, and then they get released later based on DNA evidence or some other kind of evidence that gets them out. But there's other stuff that you need to understand about this too, that if charges are dropped or charges are dismissed or there's an acquittal or a mistrial or a case is thrown out or something like that, that does not necessarily mean that person is completely innocent. It does not mean they are totally exonerated, okay? It means they are legally exonerated, or at least not going to be tried at that particular time, okay? It does not mean that they factually did not actually do something, okay? So one of the things that happens with the witch hunt narrative is they will lump all this stuff together and say, well, see, X number of charges were dismissed, therefore nobody ever actually did anything wrong. Well, that is a complete, total falsehood. That is not true. Another thing that I noticed while I was researching this is that a number of the people who basically crafted the witch hunt narrative or the satanic panic myth is a fairly small group of people, but they had access to all kinds of different publication outlets in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And essentially this was established primarily by journalists. A little bit of it was established by academics, but it's basically bled over into all of psychology, all of child psychology, and also it's had a huge impact in legal cases and in law schools, unfortunately, even up into affecting various judges and the way that they look at cases, and even the Supreme Court itself. This is all a very, very unfortunate series of developments that have happened, but primarily the people that you can trace back most of this stuff to are journalists. Another thing that I noticed along the way is that this is not purely a phenomenon of the political left. It's one that actually unites the left, the right, and unfortunately many of my fellow libertarians as well. And the reason that this happens is multifold. For libertarians, it's primarily because we are usually as a group suspicious of state power and state overreach. For leftists, they are typically suspicious in these things because they don't like to see police abuse of power or the legal system abusing people with basically false accusations and so on. In terms of the political right, they are suspicious because they don't like the state being involved in the family, coming in and investigating the family, taking kids away from the family, putting them in foster care, things of that nature. So this brings together these three different groups, but also this topic tends to bring together atheists or secularists. It brings together people who are pagans. It brings together people who are sort of the Anton LaVey style Church of Satan, Satanists, various other people who are into Crowleyanism or something like that, or the Temple of Set of Michael Aquino. All of these people come together and they work together to sort of silence this whole issue of the child accusations. I would also like to point out that there are a number of issues that Professor Cheit does not go into very much depth of covering in his book that I wish he had talked about more. These were about the ideas related to the tunnels that were supposedly up under the McMartin Preschool that some of the children were taken down into and supposedly abused and so forth. There were 4 separate searches for these tunnels, the 4th one being a fairly professional archaeological dig that also included a geologist. And they do seem to have discovered something that may have been what the children were referring to. It's basically unclear, but this evidence did not come out until the trial was too far along and essentially over with. Another thing he doesn't look into very much are the huge number of cases that actually never get reported, never get investigated. In the 1970s, there were laws passed that created a sort of certain positions within society that are mandated to report when they suspect child abuse, but in various surveys that I've been able to find, as many as 40% say that they have found evidence of what they suspect to be child abuse and they don't report it. So 60% will report it, 40% admit there have been cases they've seen in the past that they did not actually take to the authorities when they were supposed to. Another thing of note here is by the end of this, you will find out that some 7 jurors believed that someone was guilty in the McMartin case, but the case was essentially too complex, too complicated to render that particular verdict. There were also anywhere from as low as 3 to as many as 5 deaths associated with this case. One of them was a person who was facing separate charges of pedophilic rape, which is pretty important. Something that Professor Cheit doesn't follow up on is I found a number of sources claiming that numerous children at McMartin came up with several repeated UTIs or urinary tract infections. Some were supposedly tested positive for chlamydia and other STDs or STIs, sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections or illnesses. He also does not go into depth about the various children who said that they were given some kind of a red or pink drink, which apparently made them sleepy, caused some of them to pass out. Now, the weird thing about this is that how could 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old children come up with something that was common among other known rapists such as Bill Cosby and Jeffrey Epstein and Jimmy Savile? That came up in all 3 of those particular rape cases as well. Now I'm going to begin by reading a few short portions from a Washington Post article called The Terrible Puzzle of McMartin Preschool by Cynthia Gorney, May 17, 1988. This is actually one of the decent articles written about the subject, so she's trying to cover the basic essential facts of the beginning of the case. She says, quote, "On August 12, 1983, a woman named Judy Johnson went to the Manhattan Beach Police with a report of one abused child. There are not a great many undisputed facts in the chronology of the Manhattan Beach preschool investigations, but that is one of them. All sides also agree on the following. That Judy Johnson told police her 2.5-year-old son had told her Bucky or Ray Ray had molested him, and that 2 examining physicians found evidence that the boy had in fact been sodomized. Actually, it was 3. You'll find that out later. That a Manhattan Beach police officer telephoned 5 families in late August advising them that the department was investigating, quote, improper conduct at the McMartin Preschool, and asking the parents to ask their own children whether anything had happened to them at the school. That one of these mothers testified that she immediately telephoned the school and asked Raymond Bucky's mother what the police officer was talking about. Quote, she was really shocked, or acted like she was, the mother testified, and immediately dropped the phone and said, Ray? Oh my God, Ray? Something had happened in Manhattan Beach, something dreadful and massive and utterly new. But nobody, not the parents, not the babysitter whose garden was dug up in search of buried bones, not the police officer who began seeing a therapist so he might stop lying awake at 4 a.m. with the words of the children all banging around inside him. Nobody in the town could prove exactly what it was. Possibly it was Satanists. Possibly it was child pornographers. Possibly it was, quote, hysteria, a word favored by the defense attorneys. And this is what I want you to take note of. This idea of a witch hunt, this idea of a satanic panic, of a moral panic, of a mass hysteria, began with the defense attorneys and friends of the defense team and then spread to friendly journalists. To provide a short review of where I've been and where I'm going with this series overall, I offer the following. McMartin functions as a sort of foundational myth of the postmodern secular age. Stories about mind control were associated with Chapman, Hinckley, and the assassination. of RFK, related to Sirhan, supposedly. So Michelle remembers, easily inserted into this context of lost or repressed memories, split personalities, multiple personalities, or dissociative identity disorder. What had began as the Aquarian countercultural revolution had morphed into the fallout zone of trauma-based mind control experiments. The public was starting to become familiar with new terminology about, quote, alters and, quote, triggers or trigger words that could induce a switch into new modes of conscious being. Secularists saw this as a strange but purely psychological phenomenon. Meanwhile, the religious would think more in terms of demonic possession. Either way, the once small-scale individual and cult induction of psychotrauma was now transitioning to mass application. The psychosphere of mass consciousness was being hit by mass media bouncing from single-story obsession to single-story obsession, hostage-taking, hijacking, abductions, murders, and so on. This was a pattern that continued right on through to the O.J. Simpson trial, which combined a number of sensationalistic aspects: sports, celebrity, adultery, beauty, money, and murder. Mass media had morphed into a psycho weapon, and it was being repeatedly fired on the public, perfected so as to target and splinter the populace in a dramaturgical infoscape. The outcome of the McMartin trial would take many years and 2 trials, but in 1983, 84, and 85, the public generally only knew shocking allegations. However, the late 80s saw a flood of articles published in popular outlets making outlandish claims in the opposite direction. Anyone may now be falsely accused, they said. Beltway establishmentarians began to close ranks, united to say the accusations had to be spurious. A number of ritual abuse skeptics were suddenly in newspapers coast to coast, quoted at length or penning negative pieces. Many had CIA connections, others have been found defending pedophilia, and some have even published pedophilic material in the past. Skeptical articles and TV shows poured out regularly from 1986 into the early 1990s. 60 Minutes put together a lavishly sympathetic episode in November of 1986, painting the defendants in a positive light. Ultimately, the 2 trials ended with charges dropped or as a mistrial. Obvious foul-ups took place on both sides. An overzealous DA running for election, an unwavering prosecutor, but also media manipulation by the defense. However, after it ended, at least 7 jurors believed that some of the children had been abused, but the case was simply too complicated. Plagued by investigative errors from the beginning, it created an insurmountable mess, short of overwhelming evidence, which did not emerge. The results of a later archaeological dig that did seem to confirm some tunnels was never admitted to trial. 3 witnesses died before they could testify in the case. The second trial ended in the summer of 1990. Suggestive and leading questions were among the biggest problems for the case overall. In 1988, a new scandal erupted. Children in foster care in Omaha, Nebraska were being abused. They were being transported to parties and handed over into the grabby paws of the rich and powerful. The information for this had been compiled for 2 years by the State Foster Care Review Board, which handed the information over to the Executive Board of the Nebraska Legislature. This was the beginning of the Franklin cover-up. The information had emerged due to an investigation into Larry King, the former vice chairman of the National Black Republican Council. Lawrence E. King, Jr., not the suspenders-wearing interviewer, had reportedly pilfered about $40 million from the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. Investigations were taking place at both the state and federal level. The FBI moved in immediately with concerns about child pornography and children being paid for sex with the stolen loot by King. Abuse was reported to numerous specialists who, contrary to McMartin, were not leading with questions or suggestions. 3 separate investigations were opened looking into embezzlement, money laundering, and child prostitution. King was flamboyant and often traveled with a troupe of young men. Limousines, jets, credit cards, you name it. A half-dozen teens made accusations of exploitation. One witness passed 4 separate polygraphs. A complex array of considerations were of import. Had the statute of limitations ran out? What about the age of consent at the time? And so on. King and 4 others were prime suspects, dubbed the Franklin Five. one of whom was actually arrested on supposedly unrelated charges of sexual assault on minors. There were accusations that Larry King was using Boys Town like a candy store. As I delve further into McMartin, what you will find is this. To investigate a crime, you first need a criminal complaint, reasonable suspicion of the commission of a crime, and, if the accusation is homicide, who was the victim? Where was the victim killed? Where was the body disposed of? If none of these, what is the evidence that a body was disposed of? The fewer of these that one can answer, the investigation increases in difficulty multifold. You cannot even move on means, motive, and opportunity if there is no body of a victim or identity of a victim who should now, at minimum, be a missing person. There then needs to be substantial corroborating evidence, beyond testimony, what weapons or implements were used and the like. All of this becomes more complicated based on staff and budget limitations and massive media coverage due to sensationalistic claims. If murder, sacrificial rituals, blood rites, blood drinking, and cannibalism are involved, the kill site should be laden with evidence, prints, blood, bones, etc. Luminol, cadaver dogs, and great interrogators should be able to turn up something. Moving from homicides to rapes, there are different standards of evidence. Upon those, it certainly seems very untoward things were done to many of the McMartin children. Urinary tract infections, chlamydia, possibly other STIs. Multiple medical professionals observed telltale signs of wounds, injuries, and lacerations consistent with the children's claims of sexual abuse. The defense was literally able to work with a former member of the prosecution team and ended up getting many of his notes through a third party. They centered their focus on destroying witness credibility, that of the children, attacking the credibility of the experts, who too often asked the children leading questions. They amplified the outrageous claims and disagreements between witnesses in order to cast doubt on the more substantive abuse claims. The prosecution also made very superficial and weak attempts to detect or verify the secret tunnels. In fact, they often only searched in areas that were not even clearly indicated by the children. A much later archaeological investigation turned up important evidence at a time that was too late to present at trial. Recently, a local television station did a follow-up on McMartin, where many of the adult children still insist that they were molested. By who? We're not sure. When? We don't know. And we may never know the full truth about what happened. But that something happened, it seems very clear. When we combine with the standard MO established by the Epstein case, Sandusky using the second mile to procure victims, and now the Nixium cult, there are through lines of similarities. The wealthy and the politically connected set up procedures in order to recruit fresh victims. Human trafficking takes place, compromising photographs or information are collected, and child sex trafficking sits at the dark heart of it all. The Satanic Panic mythos, or witch hunt narrative, is rooted in a litany of provable falsehoods. The phenomenon has been split into opposing dichotomies from the beginning. Either children never lie or never tell of imagined or implanted memories, versus children are easily misled by adults into making up fantastical criminal accusations, thus all such accusations are dubious. The notions of hysteria and witch hunts were born almost directly out of the McMartin defense team and spread rapidly among the media, but now I must rewind to how the case began and played out. The McMartin case began with the pain and suffering of an almost 3-year-old boy. It was the summer of 1983. Young Matthew Johnson had repeated episodes of abdominal pains and even rectal bleeding at times. His mother, Judy Johnson, was by all accounts at this time a perfectly ordinary lady with no known issues. This is important because the Satanic Panic mythos has retroactively cast aspersions upon Judy's character without support. When Judy asked her small son about his pains, he told her something about a, quote, Mr. Ray. Judy then took Matthew to their primary pediatric physician, who was disturbed by what was observed. Dr. Siegel was a pediatrician at the internationally renowned Kaiser Permanente. Dr. Siegel advised further follow-up and directed Judy to the hospital ER. Dr. McGarry, who made the same highly concerning observations of Matthew's damaged body, began to exercise all due caution and suggested that Judy see yet a third physician, this one with a specific expertise in child abuse at UCLA. Matthew was then taken to the children's clinic at UCLA, where Dr. Linda Gordon, along with another senior physician and graduate of Johns Hopkins, again made disconcerting findings of bruising in the rectal area. Per mandatory reporting laws, the senior physician then contacted the Manhattan Beach Police Department to report a case of forcible sodomy on a child. This is important because the witch hunt narrative falsely claims that Judy Johnson first ran around looking for problems and then reported it to the police. This is not what happened. This is very important because the witch hunt narrative often says that the child's mother first called the police wildly out of the blue without any basis for concern. The disturbing findings regarding young Matthew set Judy down a path from whence she could not return. It is perfectly understandable that it had devastating effects on her psyche. Like most police departments at the time, the MBPD had virtually no experience with child sexual abuse cases, especially of very young children. Then, in an incredibly ill-advised move, the chief of police sent out a letter to all the parents listed in the preschool's enrollment records. This letter not only named the initial suspect, Ray Buckey, aka Mr. Ray, and listed some of the accusations and suggested that parents ask their own kids if anything had happened. Obviously, this opened a massive can of worms and would be used by the defense team later and the constructors of the Satanic Panic mythos. Despite this, the case still somehow remained outside of the purview of the media. There was no coverage at all at this time. Key to the mythos is the false claim that Judy Johnson made a baseless report to police, and then, just all of a sudden, the media was all over the case and things completely exploded. That is not what actually happened. Professor Cheit's original source research found that a few reports were made, 8 total, that were highly suggestive of child molestation far before it ever made it to the media, but it is difficult to overemphasize the difficulty in investigating and prosecuting cases where the victim witnesses are primarily 5 or under or were at the time of abuse, many of whom were also pre-verbal or nonverbal or terrified to report strange adults how they had been harmed by inappropriate touching. The facts surrounding the earliest cases reported are critical because all of those facts undermine the claims of the myth makers because they say that the case was shaped almost entirely by leading questions and interviews by overzealous people at CII, or Children's Institute International. This was the organization that eventually took over many of the interviews that took place much later down the road, where there were a number of terrible leading questions asked of the children that completely imploded the case. Also notable is that these facts are utterly contrary to the hysteria narrative. Many parents did not even want to be involved at all in this case, yet slowly a total of 19 probable reports rolled into the police before the DA's office ever directed the families to CII for interviews in a setting more attuned to the needs of the children. Again, this completely implodes the claims that children only had memories implanted by their questioners at some later period. This is not how it took place. Another thing to keep in mind during this is that for CII, there were no guidelines. There were no lists of best practices as to how to conduct therapy interviews with a view towards cooperation with prosecution later. This was a therapeutic setting for therapeutic purposes to ascertain what actually happened, and how they did that, they were not thinking about criminal trials. At the same time, this is where things began to expand dramatically. Unfortunately, much of what was learned during the interviews never even made it to trial at all. This is also unfortunate for the witch hunt narrative because they try to act as if everything that happened there did make it to trial when it actually did not. And still yet, beyond the interviews, there was also mounting medical evidence. One mother reported her child often suffered from a malodorous fluid discharge. Sadly, both types of evidence would be drawn into question at trial, lumped together and diminished or dismissed altogether. Predictably, the constructors of the witch hunt narrative act as if none of the medical evidence was ever of any value whatsoever. Complicating matters even more, once the case was picked up by the media, a whole sideshow developed where groups with no children began to insinuate themselves into the investigation. These people began to make media contacts and promoted the idea that there were tunnels under the school where some children claimed they were being abused. A few of them even hovered around the case through its end in the early 1990s. And although the tunnels may actually have been real, the sensationalistic aspects did more damage to the case than helped. A number of shocking things happened during the pre-trial and trial process. 3, 4, or even 5 deaths ended up associated with the trial. The closed McMartin Preschool was partially burned in a fire by an arsonist. The powder keg itself was set in February of 1984 when a Los Angeles ABC News affiliate first reported the case, and it was full of lurid and dramatic claims about rampant sexual abuse, not just there but all over the city as things began to expand. The reporter was Wayne Satz, and it is highly likely that the source of his information was Key McFarland, who was the top child therapy investigator at CII, and possibly other people at CII as well. Later, they were to develop a close relationship that was also a problem for the case itself. If the 1980s were a TV show, the McMartin case would be the wraparound story that continually came up, faded, came up again, and it was to be a bit of a circus as TV talk shows exploited it to provide a platform for claims that tens of thousands of babies and children were being sacrificed to Satan every year. However, that does not match the facts of the McMartin case itself. For better or worse, the media report lit a real fire under the case and reports began to pour in, and understandably the Manhattan Beach community was both concerned and upset that police were not doing more. There is no doubt the DA's office completely botched the case from stem to stern. When an already messy investigation in an unfamiliar territory of such young children was combined with massive pressure for arrests and prosecutions, the pressure burst the pipes. As part of this was also conducted during an election cycle. Oversight was very poor, and as a grand jury was rapidly convened, arrests were made and hundreds of charges were set upon them. The prosecution's haphazard actions literally set a trap for themselves and doomed the case from its very outset. Because the case was so poorly handled, because things were so rushed, the grand jury ended up indicting the elderly Virginia McMartin, who was confined to a wheelchair, an absolutely disastrous image for the media frenzy. So not only was she indicted and Mr. Ray, or Ray Ray as some children suggested was their abuser, Ray Bucky, his mom, his sister, plus 3 McMartin teachers. The preliminary hearing for the case took almost a year and a half. It was here that every crack in the state's case began to appear. The defense early on honed in on attacking child witness credibility, began the claims of a witch hunt taken up by journalists and rampantly misapplied to dozens of other cases, and effectively intimidating many children and their parents with the prospects of withering cross-examinations. This dropped potential trial participants from 41 all the way down to 14. Meanwhile, many parents sought special testimony provisions for the children to be allowed to testify by means of CCTV or closed-circuit television from another nearby room, such as the judge's chambers. This would be a big mess down the road for appeals because of the Sixth Amendment right to face one's accuser, sometimes referred to as the Confrontation Clause. This is one of those technicalities which could result in charges being dropped, an acquittal, or a verdict being overturned later under appeal. Next, the new DA dropped charges against 5 defendants, leaving only Ray and his mother. The cross-examination phase was nothing like what one sees on TV or in a film. One boy was on the stand on 17 different days, with 16 of those comprised a fine-toothed comb cross-examination. It was during this phase that some of the salacious claims emerged about corpses, the drinking of blood, and other aspects of SRA or satanic ritual abuse. Commenters are sharply divided on whether this lends credibility or destroys it entirely. As far as the court was concerned, this was very damaging to the case and added unnecessary layers of complication by suddenly jolting the prosecution team. A junior member of the prosecution team who abandoned ship to ink a potentially lucrative book and movie deal and possibly took critical information with him that may have leaked to the defense team, Glenn Stevens, even said what was done to the children on the stand was both monstrous and inhumane. The judge ruled against remote testimony and several witnesses dropped, which forced the DA's office to drop those charges related to those children too. Slowly but surely the case was melting away. This divided the public between those who heard of the initial accusations, the idea of the largest child sex abuse case in history. Several arrests were made, hundreds of charges were leveled, totaling hundreds of years in prison, dropping down, down, down. To them, this began to look like a conspiratorial cover-up, and who could blame them? As for the hysteria witch hunt side, they say, see, there was never really anything going on to begin with, just overactive imaginations. Both sides are flawed, as revealed in Dr. Cheit's book. It's also important here to remember that outside of this case there were events taking place that lent credibility to the idea that Satanism or Luciferianism could be involved. For example, from April of 1984 until August of 1985, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, openly worshipped Satan and even left pentagrams at many of his rape and murder scenes. During his trial, Ramirez drew a pentagram on the palm of his hand and even yelled out, "Hail Satan." Based upon highly publicized episodes such as these, there was really no reason for the public to give up their original beliefs that Satanism had been involved with the McMartin case. Ramirez had raped or murdered 14 separate victims and never showed any signs of remorse. Meanwhile, as we move from the pre-trial to the actual trial of McMartin, the victim witness list had plummeted from 41 all the way down to 11. The prosecution attempted to introduce as much character evidence about Ray Buckey as could have been relevant. He drank alcohol, may have used drugs. Others witnessed clear signs of psychological instability. Others saw him intentionally expose himself. He was also known not to wear underwear, even while donning small shorts. And he was once seen looking at a Playboy magazine with children sitting in his lap, which none of the Buckeys seemed to have any trouble with at all. The verdict finally came down and the jury was hung. 7 jurors later admitted that they believed Ray Buckey was guilty, but the case was simply too big, too complicated, too complex to attain the level of guilt with no room for reasonable doubt. Ray was then put through a rapid retrial, where once more the jury was divided. All charges were eventually dropped, and the many years and millions of dollars and the lives massively disrupted were to move on, especially the children. Real evidence of abuse existed, but the mythos of the Satanic Panic demanded that be erased from history. A horrific trial process that may have led Paul Bynum to commit suicide before testifying, led Judy Johnson to emotional and psychological collapse and to drink herself into oblivion, and another possible suspect to overdose. But the manufactured narrative of the witch hunt and Satanic Panic mythos had to conquer all truth. The evil that men do lives after them, and the false construction of a simplistic explanation does not get to paper over the pain of those who have been victimized. Here I would like to attach an addendum or postscript. There were a number of important topics I opted to gloss over or leave out entirely. There may be a need to address these in a separate episode covering the role of the former FBI section chief of Los Angeles, Ted Gunderson, the final archaeological dig by Dr. George Stickle for the tunnels, which seems to have uncovered something of importance. Other aspects of the Satanism or Luciferian phenomena of the 1980s, such as animal mutilations, problems with child abuse cases, and the statute of limitations on such crimes at the time, films related to these subjects in the 1980s, and the ways in which McMartin was abused as a so-called paradigmatic exemplar of other cases throughout the 1980s. Next, I may also put together a bonus episode on the Country Walk case, or Frank Fuster, who was a convicted child molester and often gets lumped in together with the McMartin case and many others in the 1980s to say that he too is also innocent, which, when you hear the facts of the case, is absolutely preposterous. In the following episode, I'll be taking a look into the Franklin cover-up, or the Franklin scandal, which implicated dozens of powerful and influential people in child sex trafficking that went not just to Washington, D.C. from Omaha, Nebraska, but from Boys Town right into the White House itself. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.